Kalisperasis. Good evening, everyone. Hope you're all well. Thanks for braving the cold. Allow me to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's seminar by Associate Professor Robert Nelson on Should We Reject Byzantium? Before we move to tonight's seminar, some household items. As we enter winter, all the 5 seminars in the month of June and early July will be online. So look out for your emails and you can follow them on YouTube or sort of Facebook. They will be on quite diverse topics, from political prisoners in Greece to stolen children to vlachs in Monastir, present-day Bitola, and gender in the Greek language. Specifically next Thursday's 5th of June seminar will be by Greek-Canadian Professor Sakis Gekas, and we'll be speaking on From PAK to PASOK, Anti-Dictatorship Resistance in Toronto and the Metapolitivsi. When it comes to diaspora and migrant experience, Canada is probably the country where we have the most affinity and similarities. With respect to tonight's seminar, I would also like to thank John Sahinidis, who's our sponsor. Thank you for the kind donation. I invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. There are still quite a few seminars left without sponsors. Now let's return to tonight's topic. Should we reject Byzantium? This week's seminar was quite easy to prepare for. All I needed to do was look back at my notes of 2 years ago when Olympia Nelson opened the seminar series. I think tonight we have a very unique situation where for the first time in any seminar series, and I'd say probably even globally, we have a father-daughter combination, a father-daughter tag team defending Byzantium against infidels like myself and other people in the audience. As Greeks, we've always held some ambivalence towards Byzantium. Weren't Hellenes persecuted in Byzantium? Didn't Byzantine emperors close down philosophical schools, etc., etc.? It's not like classical Greece where we overcompensate and believe that the ancient Greeks invented everything, or at least everything worth inventing. There's also metafotas, mas χρωστάνε, as we like to remind people. And I will leave out my disparaging remarks for those plagiarist Italians as well. So. To be fair, history is always more complicated. There are many shades of grey. If it wasn't for the Byzantine interlude, would the Greek language have survived until today? However, today's seminar will focus on the actual usage of the term Byzantine and Byzantium, as they're recent terms coined by scholars. Byzantium was, after all, the Eastern Roman Empire and its citizens Romans. But this later development is not unique. Pontians, for example, have only been calling themselves Pontians for barely 100 years, before they were Romi, or Romans. Does a later realization of an identity make it less legitimate, or does it confer separateness and clarity as identity and memory evolve? Some scholars have argued for the cessation of the use of the term Byzantium. Interestingly, University of Chicago classic scholar Anthony Kaldelis has provocatively titled his recent title on Byzantium, The New Rome. Our speaker today, Professor Robert Nelson, will argue the case for the use of the term Byzantium, and is ideologically sounder than the terms proposed to replace it. When I initially invited Robert to present at this series, I had in mind a sort of coming out session. Most people in the Greek community simply know him as Olympia's dad, since Olympia is everywhere, just like the Genisa Kritas, guarding and defending the frontiers of Byzantium. However, Robert is his own person, he's an individual, he does have a fascinating personality, and a very impressive scholarly track record himself. And let me remind you, don't forget, he's the apple tree, Olympia is the apple. Okay. Thought I set the record straight, Rob, so don't get. A few words about Robert. He's a principal honorary fellow at Melbourne University. He trained in art history at La Trobe with an MA in Baroque art and a PhD in Hellenistic art. Later on, he taught art design and architecture at Monash University, where he became Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies. He has written over 1,000 articles as the art critic for The Age, as well as 2 books on art, The Visual Language of Painting and The Spirit of Secular Art, as well as many other titles. So, Robert, can I welcome you to the podium? Okay. Big round of applause for our speaker tonight.
Thank you. It's a great honour to be here as a tree. I hope, following the analogy with the apples, that I don't give you the pip. So, actually, thank you, Nick. You've pretty much summed up my whole lecture, and I don't really have to give it. It's exactly as Nick said. So this is a very fateful day where I don't want to say celebrate, we mourn the final downfall of Constantinople. That's this day, and so when I say, should we reject Byzantium? Of course, Byzantium here is in inverted commas. It's the word Byzantium. It would be a terrible impiety to say we should reject the Byzantine tradition today, of all days. So, and I agree with Nick, by the way. There's a lot to talk about that's beautiful in Byzantium, and equally, of course, frightening. And I'm certainly not going to be, painting a kind of favourable or critical picture of that great civilization. It remains open for all sorts of critiques. But the precise issue that I wanted to talk about is that, as Nick says, the scholarly mood is afoot to expunge from art history and from every other kind of history the word Byzantium. It is seen increasingly as illegitimate, and the grounds for it, as Nick says, that the people that we think of as Byzantine people themselves saw themselves as Romans, and this has been, I guess, the words that we know, Romae. And possibly a country, Romanía, which would subtend all the lands of the empire, really should be used again to describe this empire. We shouldn't be using a sort of a term of art, which has unfortunate connotations. So, you might be landed with difficulties with the tax office and find that you can't get through, or the bank, or the probate office, or whatever, and you'll say, "Oh my God, a Byzantine institution." It's incredibly pejorative. So, we're saddled with this term that a lot of people resent because it's got this kind of baggage. Rightly or wrongly, that of a sort of moribund protocols, a culture that couldn't move, that was in some sense mortified from within, perhaps suffocated by its own theology, or all sorts of problems that people project onto Byzantium, which they could equally do with any other civilization, but let's not worry. It's mapped onto then. And because the people writing about Byzantium are often from the West, people like me, people from America and Germany, and so there's a fear that there's also a kind of recurrent motif of neglecting the east of Europe, positioning it as other, in effect taking away its power, by giving it this kind of alien name that was not proper to itself. So it's a kind of... and I think on the screen, one of the points that we'll come back to a few times is that Rome began as... and you can see that Byzantine churches borrow hugely from Roman precedent. They are Roman churches in a way. They're full of drums, full of arches, the mighty masonry and so on. And so there's this continuity between Rome and East Rome that is preserved by a word like East Rome. So if you call it Romanía, or if you preserve in some sense this what's the word, like a tradition, I suppose, a legacy of Rome, that's a good thing. But this is not a trivial issue. And the way that we name things really does count. And thank you, Nick, for invoking our First Nations people, to whom I'd also pay respects. And we're now in a mood where we want to be careful about how we name our places. The very word Australia is Latin. Should we not perhaps have some curiosity for what might be a collective word before that, if that's possible? Were there collective words for the regions that we're inhabiting? And so we're tentatively making these steps, and a lot of people say, well, I come from Melbourne, Naarm, and so on. And so it counts. Yes, this is an important symbol. Does it reflect their story, that is to say, the original inhabitants, or does it only reflect our story as the people who have arrived for 200 years, after 200 years, but since 200 years? So I guess this debate about whether or not we call it Byzantium or East Rome maps onto a whole sort of post-colonial discourse about what is the politically the right thing to say. And I think, sorry about that there. I'll just skip to that. One of the options that we have is Romanía, and so I'm following scholars like, as Nick mentioned, Anthony Caldelis, who favours the term Romanía as obviously the country of Rome. And I think there's a problem about this. The first thing is that Romanía, the closer you move to Rome, Roman times, like the Rome of the Caesars, the imperial period, the less it appears. And when it does appear, it's really quite confusing. I've got a couple of instances there where Athanasius describes Rome as the capital city of Romania. Now, Athanasius is writing after Constantine, well after. It's the 4th century, later 4th century. So for him, the capital of Romania was not Constantinople, but Rome. So that's not a good match for what we're talking about, not for Athanasius. And then the instance of John Chrysostom, and he talks about the influx of Arabs whose presence was felt then. As you can read, bunches together this whole lot of places that were formerly under the control of Constantinople. This is like saying the coronavirus swept through the USA and Connecticut and Texas and California. It isn't making any sense. So I think it's a very confusing word, but my greatest reservation is, apart from it being sort of confusing, there's some sort of delightful humility about Byzantium as well as its boastfulness that I would love to go into. But Romania hardly appears in Greek literature, the word. So, you could look at lots and lots of your favourite Byzantine authors. The word Romania does not feature. And not including Sophronius, who was witness to the same Ishmaelites that Chrysostom was complaining about, in other words, the Arabs. Even Procopius doesn't mention, these are really big historians, and they don't mention the name of the empire as Romania. And you can find it, it's there, Anna Komnene uses it, Pselos. A whopping 14 times it appears in Kedrenos, but Kedrenos wrote an awful lot, and 14 times isn't that much. And if I could just invoke at the risk of, using the West as the gold standard, but if I'm used to reading, 16th century literature. I'll just skip that lovely image. I'm peppering the talk with images that I've just thought you might like to consider. Do these images strike you as Byzantine, or do they strike you as East Roman? And I just thought that would be funny to imagine. Anyway, so in the 16th century, I've got lots of lovely authors like Guicciardini, who uses the term Italia over 1,000 times, just in the novelle. Now, to be sure, the novelle is a thick book, but there the word Italia is listed 160 times. And by the way, these figures are cleaned of things like Italiani, it's actually the name of the country. And so you go right down to Il Cortegiano is a lot shorter book. Il Principe is a very thin book, and yet the name Italia arises 49 times. So in the whole of Greek literature, from let's say from Constantine to Lights Out today, there are only 600 uses of that word. So, it just strikes me as extremely weak, this consciousness of an empire under the name of Romanía. I just don't credit it. And I also think that there's a kind of pattern there that it's hardest to understand the earlier it is, and it's used more prolifically later in the day. And to me, that's kind of telling that it's like it's a sort of could we please be Rome? It's a kind of hope, a projection, and I think given that pattern, it's probably the worst rubric to give the Byzantine Empire to indicate continuity with Rome, because it actually flourishes as a name well after the imperial vigour, as it were, had ebbed. So that strikes me as an unhappy replacement then for the word, this term of art that we've got of Byzantium. It could conceivably, it does obviously emphasise Romanist, if you want to, and this is a subject that I really want to hone in on from now on, if you want to emphasise Romanist. And why would you want to do that? Well, I really don't buy the idea that there was some terrible kind of corruption in the word Byzantium, that Byzantium has so discredited the empire that we look upon its things with embarrassment. What rubbish. We look upon those things with awe. And we do not look at that and say, oh my goodness, how inferior, or they were only, they were all into palace intrigues, or they were all into, hypocrisy, or, they only had an empire because they were double-crossing their enemies, whatever. This is just not a problem in art and design. And I think, to be fair, scholars like Anthony Caldelas do recognise that the word Byzantium does work quite well for art historians, architectural historians, and so on. But my view of this is really the word Byzantium has never done anybody any harm. This is a figment of the imagination, because we're all sort of looking for students in universities, and when numbers decline, we think, ooh, we might have the wrong brand name. But it's seldom the cause. And if you think of other terms, like, as I say, I think of Byzantine as sublime. But, you know, Gothic is, was an insult. Goths are people who sort of split your skull, and raid your beaches and, rape and... So Goths, to call architecture of the north of Europe Gothic, that was absolutely an insult when it began. And of course, it's what we co-opted by people who love that architecture. And in short order, Gothic becomes a highly celebratory term, just like Byzantine. And the same is true of Baroque. The same is true of Rococo. Even Impressionism started out as an insult. These terms are highly pejorative in their origins. It has no effect at all on the fame and durability of the styles and the people, the reputations of the people who did them. And I mean, I think you could say, well, yes, but we're in denial because we're talking about people whose identity as Romans has been stripped from them. That they didn't call themselves Byzantine, and this is true. But then I would say, yes, but neither did anyone in the Baroque call themselves Baroque. Neither did, it would have been news to Cavalli or Monteverdi that they were Baroque composers. They didn't know what Baroque was. And, so you could say, oh, this would be really squeaky clean about this. We wouldn't need to use words like Baroque, we could just say 17th century. How boring. Because Baroque is describing something unique to the 17th century. And early 18th century and so on. So, and I think on the strength of pedantry, it's very, very foolish to trash these names. I mean, an example would be Egypt. Egypt is not an Egyptian word, it's a Greek word. So is Ethiopia, Greek word. I would discourage any Egyptologist from abandoning the word Egypt or Egyptology. That would be a really bad move. There's good identity embodied in the word Egypt, even though it has nothing to do with Egyptians, other than that it applies to them. And, look, language is language. It's not just bricks and mortar. I know, it's just your heart melts, doesn't it? I don't buy this thing about colonisation, least of all because when we're sticking up for these Byzantines and saying, oh, their identity as Romans has been expropriated by later historians because they're now called Byzantine, I say, well, hang on, I mean, this... And thanks for telling me that even in Calabria, the word Byzantine has enormous prestige. And of course, throughout the Balkans and going as north as Russia, it's an adored appellation. So I don't really see that. It would seem to me that for Western scholars, and I've got to say, Anthony Caldelas, I think Greek is his first language, and certainly is not mine. So I guess he has the right to talk, but it seems to me that to expropriate a word from people who own that word is actually a colonial strategy, at the very least, very high-handed. And right at the bottom of the slide is this self-identifier. How did they describe themselves? And it is a significant thing. And sometimes one uses this word emic, again, Greek derivation, obviously, but I'm mistrustful of that. And I call myself Australian, even though the word Australian is Latin, and and I think, well, how do other people call themselves? And I think the example of well, we know how that guy called himself, but he didn't call himself Christ. So just joking. But Jesus, anyway. Germans, take the example of Germans. And Germans, die Deutschen, do not get insulted by the fact that the French call them les Allemands, the Italians call them i tedeschi, we Anglo people call them Germans, Germanii, so very similar in Greek, and the Russians call them Nemci. Nemci is actually like dumb people because they can't speak. Obviously, they can't speak Slavic, so they don't have language. You know, the Slovo is like the Slav. So lacking the Slovo, they're dumb, right? So look, Germans don't care. They're die Deutschen, and they don't care what other people call them. They call them different things, but they're Germans. And, they're die Deutschen. And look, right at the bottom of the slide I suggested, if I were to call them Teutons, that would really be very supercilious of me, like that would be an insult, like etymologically very similar to Deutschen, die Deutschen, Teutons, that would be cognate, right? So I could say, oh, that's more legitimate, I should call them Teutons. Oh, come on. They're going to think you're an idiot. So, and I think rightly so, because it's like an essentialism, as if there's something in names that appeals to some innate, invariable authenticity, the like of which really never existed. And we come to this question about why did they call themselves Romans? Why did people speaking Greek, and I'm going to call them Greeks, why did they call themselves Romans? And I mean, the reason I think that we project on this is what the historians are telling us. So the historians are telling us that the empire simply moved to Constantinople with all its Roman apparatus, all the institutions. So they're two good Latin words. Holus bolus, that's Greek. Holus bolus to Constantinople, which by the way is a sort of it's got both Latin and Greek. Constantine, anyway. Let's not go into it. Therefore, the whole authority of Constantinople is Roman, and bit by bit, the courts ceased to operate in Latin and operated in Greek. But they drew their structures, good Latin word, from Rome. And so this sort of investment in authority is Roman. And to strip them of that is to strip their authority. So, and that's why we're sort of the criticism is levelled at us, that we are denialists, we are Roman denialists if we call them Greeks. And there was a long period where the term Greeks was used a little bit disparagingly. So that's baggage that we have to countenance, I must admit. But I think a better question to ask is, why actually did these people, like the people that we could imagine speaking Greek around the time of Christ, I mean, they, undoubtedly speaking Aramaic or Syriac or something like that, but certainly the first, Paul is a Roman citizen, a citizen of Rome, but writing in Greek. And why did they stop thinking of themselves as Greek? I think is the prior question. And the answer, again, is very, very simple, and that is that the word Greek from early days had been tainted. And early days are the Jewish tradition, which you've got there in the Old Testament, where the Greeks are people that you do not want to do business with. Do not share the sacred things of this religion with Greeks. Don't make a covenant with them. This goes straight into New Testament discourse. where you see there, Paul, quite resentful of the fact that the Greeks who seek after wisdom scorn this moria of the Greeks. By the way, I'm using the King James version of the New Testament. That word Greeks there, the Greeks, unto the Greeks foolishness, that is in fact not Greeks but heathen, the ethnoi in the original. But the King James translators were so used to this equation of the heathen with the Greeks that they actually just used the word Greek to mean heathen, ethnicin, the heathens, the pagans. So this is a kind of appalling tradition then, where you're left with this, and it just rolls on and on and on. The Greeks are the people who laughed at the first Christians. And they'll never live it down. The best thing that you can do is to stop calling yourself Greek. So this disavowal actually has an anterior story where in fact we want to forswear Greek identity because of this coupling with pagan antiquity, where you scoff at, and look at the verbs, chlefazousi and and I've got a lovely another word in it, yelosi, beautiful, laugh at. Isn't it good? And another example, I'll just skip that beautiful mosaic from Ravenna. Athanasios is a very, very powerful voice. There you are, Nick, with your apistia. Yes, the asirontes. That's a lovely derision, deriding, wow. Every insult that you can find, they will throw at the Greeks. These are Greek-speaking church fathers. People of enormous authority in the formation of not just the religion and its practice, but the culture. Were you going to call yourself Greek? I don't think so. And this is one of the greatest puzzles of writing in these centuries, and that is that the Romans, did no Roman ever laugh at what must have struck them as just as absurd? I mean, the Romans were also the inheritors of Stoic traditions, of, Cynic traditions. They're full of it. Of course they laughed, but they're not known to have laughed. They get a free pass. They're like Pontius Pilate, who washes his hands of, Christ's death. Historically, the Romans don't take on this taint of the mockery of the religion. There are amazing coincidences. Like, for instance, the Roman emperor, best known for the persecutions, is Diocletian. Well, why did he have to have a Greek name? The proconsul that orders the flogging and crucifixion of Andrew, his name is Greek. I've forgotten it just momentarily. Anyway, not a Latin name like Pilatus. Anyway, these Greeks are essentially abominable, and in defiance of the religion, they're remembered that way. The tag is ineradicably tied to the doubt that this is all rubbish. And so it could not be invoked. It's very sad. This is our patrimony. Like I said, it's cruel. It's hard to sort of match this with the narrative that I started out with. That oh no, we must call these people Romans for their own good, because that's what they called themselves. And then you think, well, yeah, but maybe they were kind of wrong. Like, was that right that they stopped calling themselves Greek? They're still talking Greek. And heaven knows, after 400 years of Turkish occupation, Greek identity re-emerged, can I say, as more proudly than ever. And it sort of makes me feel that this interlude where, you know what, I think my conclusion is really this. I don't think Byzantium had a name. It wasn't Byzantium, obviously, because, by the way, Procopius does use the word Byzantium, someone was called to Byzantium. He doesn't call it Constantinople in a couple of instances. That's interesting. But it wasn't Romanía. It's sort of an empire without a name, which is why I like giving it a name that suits what it did. And what it did was produce incredible artefacts, beautiful pieces of theology, beautiful pieces of art, beautiful pieces of architecture, beautiful language. Rehearse this language, develop this language. They would have been dancing beautifully. We know from the theologians like Chrysostom, who hated the dance and the theatre, that they were doing these sorts of things. And so the word that honours their production, I think, is more worthy than the word that honours some supposed intrinsic kind of character that was actually an imposition or completely artificial or an invention that was used to cover up an embarrassment. And so I don't want anything that celebrates this expunging, this deletion of Greek identity. It just strikes me as obscene. Why would we be doing this? So yes, in the absence of being able to call yourself Greek, well, we'll call ourselves Roman. By analogy to our First Nation people, maybe they don't have a collective name in the hundreds of Indigenous languages in this country that corresponds to Aborigines. Some of my First Nations friends call themselves Aborigines. I don't. But the fact that they do sometimes doesn't mean that that's all right. So they call themselves Romans. So what? It was sort of imposed. What else am I going to call myself? So I don't find this post-colonial discourse at all helpful. More the opposite. And finally, I think, if we come to a very famous, this is really, really close to our fateful day when Platon writes this, and you'll recognise that, that this is really another very amusing thing, this great resource, Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, that electronically captures Greek literature, has a Latin name, and all of the Greek texts within it are named in Latin. So anyway, you can see by the Latin name that is a letter that he wrote, or an oration that he wrote to Manuel Palaeologus. Oh, this is a very sad, this is a sad day, right? This is toward the end. This is the end of Byzantium, the last days. And he's saying that we are Greeks. And he says, and look, it's a really sad letter, actually, because he goes on to say, and we're also Romans because the Romans came from Troy. So drawing on the great myth of Virgil, we too are Romans, but it's weak. It's way back. It's just a myth. He knows it. We are Greek. By language and by upbringing, And was he a Roman? Did he think of himself as a Roman? I don't know. But he certainly thought of himself as Greek. And I think probably if he did call himself a Roman, it's sort of not very meaningful. It's like window dressing. Like people call themselves things that are not, terribly, terribly significant. I mean, I'm a Victorian, does that make me very different from a Tasmanian or a New South Wales person? It's not terribly. Names aren't necessarily meaningful in the way that you love them or not. And I don't see that much love. And so I think the last thing that I would ever want to invoke for the purposes of post-colonial discourse is an attachment to Rome. Rome is colonial to the core. It's hegemony. I appeal to the term Byzantium, not because I think it is a necessary match in the way that our critics are saying East Rome is a necessary match. There's nothing necessary about Byzantium, but gee, it's good. And I love it that it's a placeholder, that it's provisional. We say Byzantine knowing that they didn't call themselves Byzantine. That makes it better, because we don't know what they called themselves, really, meaningfully. All that we know is that there was an incentive to call yourself Roman by a kind of embarrassment that personally I would like to disavow and never pass on for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that sort of fascinating presentation. And I'm sure there'll be a few questions from the audience. John?
I get the first question, don't I? Thanks for that, Robert. Money well spent by me. So, rather than try to change the name because of its derogatory connotations, maybe we should try to lift the reputation of the word and the, if you like, the civilization. And how do you think we could do that? By try to lift the reputation of the word rather than try to change it because we're embarrassed because it's associated with negative connotations.
Yes, I agree. I think that's a beautiful challenge, and wholeheartedly agree and mindful of what Nick said, that there's plenty in Byzantium to deplore. They did awful things like any other power. They're cruel, but it's a little bit. Can I say it's a little bit like an athlete with newbie gains. Like, we're at a point where so few people know how good it is that you can have a kind of efflorescence of interest because it's novel. So we have that in our favour, that Byzantium is a kind of unknown continent for, I would say, most of art historians. You know, there was this thing. Oh yes, and they're the unadventurous people that Vasari calls, you know, maniera goffa greca. But you know, if inducted into what the magic of those pictures is, then I think we have a field day. And I think it's infectiously beautiful. The fact that it couples so well with the theology, the fact that you know, you can so easily inject a critique into it, because a lot of this stuff is awful. There are prejudices afoot, and this is the sort of thing that scholarship loves. So I think the mistake is often to see seduction purely in the good. That there's equal. Like, I think that often people's fascination with civilizations like Incan and so on is often their, you know, what to many is a sort of barbarism, you know, or the interment practices of, you know, pharaohs and things like that, that actually, bizarrely, have a great mystique. And so, not that I'm recommending telling tales of cruelty for the good of the historian, but in the most uncynical way, I think there is a necessary story to confront.
Robert, do we know, during Byzantine times, how strong was regional identity? Because elevating regional identity isn't that one way of sort of, you know, navigating things, like, you know, downplaying the Greekness and not getting involved with the Romanists by elevating the regional identity. Do we know how strong that was, or can we tell from the writings? Or?
You know, that's a very good question. I'm not aware of a kind of, you know how in classical Greek, you know, you can immediately see what's Attic, what's, you know, Doric, what's Ionian Greek, you know. Whereas with the sort of well, you know, like Kini is like global throughout the Mediterranean. And equally, if they aspire to sort of Attic diction, you know, so you've got, that's kind of standardised. So you don't get the confession of that in language, which is where you might start to look. The patriarchates of the five centres are meant to be in constant conversation and not at variance with one another. So you have this strong aspiration to unity. Let's not disagree with them. We'll disagree with the Latins. Disagree with them.
But there was this unity because they're involved in a series of culture wars, but that's a different story.
Yes, that's right. That's right, yes. No, and look, and there are umpteen heresies, of course, so-called. I mean, what great stuff for syllabus, you know. So there's enormous local energy as a basis for those. With like cult leaders and so on. But because of the way that this is recorded, it's centralised. So it's well, that was all sort of suppressed. I love your question, and I'm conscious that I'm not really answering it. There must have been local identities.
Thank you so much, Robert. It was wonderful. I want to ask you two things. Why does the West ignore Byzantine art and Byzantine music? And two, our ancient Greek tradition is kind of like opposed to the Byzantine tradition and vice versa. I mean, for example, when you... I do it very often when I'm in Athens. I visit an ancient monument every Sunday. So the people speaking to us, tour guides, they're called? Yeah, tour guides.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, bless you.
they tell us that, oh, sadly, the Byzantines destroyed this, or oh, those barbarians, what they've done here is like,
Spolia.
they're really like hurt by, the destruction of antiquity and ancient monuments by the Christians. That is always an issue when you are visiting those sites. So I feel that, there's a love-hate relationship. However, we have both antiquity and Byzantine heritage in us.
Yes.
I just want to hear what you think about that.
And I think along the lines that you're suggesting, I think a lot of the Western perspective on Greece is based on a kind of lacuna where we miss the classical Greece of the 5th century and we look around for people to blame. Why is it not there anymore? And we can find a culprit in the Byzantine period, the Constantinian period. So this sort of almost resentment or nostalgia, the nostalgia for 5th century Athens, which heaven knows has all of the glory that we owe it, there's no question. This is an incredible thing, and it's equally, sad to contemplate that it bit by bit, fell apart, and all that is. Vasily Adrachtas was saying it went poof.
But they invented everything.
They invented everything. Yes, that's right. Yes, they invented language, and this scapegoat of Christianity, I think, is convenient. It creates incuriosity for anything Byzantine, and my heart goes out to you with your question about Byzantine music. I swear that the reason people don't talk about it is they don't know it. They have no idea.
Why is it not? It's just, it's wealthier than Western music.
Well, I mean, and that's what survives, And Western musicologists, because they're not stupid, of course, that they will acknowledge that, oh yes, this has Byzantine origins, or this has Arab origins, and they're scrupulous. Of course, they're good scholars, but as for general community interest, this is really very, very far behind, and I think that it happens within our own. Sort of Western canon as well. There's a famous example of a Baroque composer, Telemann, who is very, very prolific, enormously gifted composer. He wrote 3,000 works. This is unbelievable. And the reputation was, at a certain point, in his day, Handel and Bach worshipped him. They thought he was a genius. And then inexplicably, his reputation went into decline. And people started to say, oh, he was just a Vielschreiber. He was just like a person who churns it out. Oh, there's no depth. It's just typical of, the sort of rubbish that people were writing. And a musicologist came along later and he said, the reason they're saying that is they have never listened to Telemann. They're just rehearsing this opinion without listening to his music, which is sublime. I mean, I'm not saying all 3,000 of these pieces are sublime, but, an awful lot of it is. And the judgment is made, and we just rehearse it endlessly until finally, because Telemann is a great genius, amazing composer. How did we get it so wrong? And it takes time, and John's formula, advertise the good. And whatever else spices the story.
Just briefly, you might have mentioned it, but can you go a bit into the etymology of the word Byzantium?
Other than the fact that it is the town, the the view is that it's from Byzas, the mythological character, yes, who settled there. So it became Byzantium, where Byzas comes from, which is a very Greek-sounding word. And this is, I've got to say, this is the other reason that I like Byzantium as a word. It is Greek. It has a Z in it, that's right.
Byzantium can also sound like a chemical element as well.
Yes, it does sound a bit like that.
There's the chemist speaking.
The chemist.
Vangelia έχεις τίποτα να ρωτήσεις?
Thank you, Robert. My question is to do with, there's been an accusation or a criticism by a lot of against Western commentators who use the term Byzantium to, in a sense, disinherit the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, as a continuation of the Roman Empire and its Greek roots and its Hellenic heritage.
Yes.
And it's used not innocently, they use the term Byzantium effectively to diminish the Eastern Roman Empire as the prestigious continuation. How would you respond to that?
So that's the allegation, thanks, yes. You're expressing very, very succinctly exactly the case that Anthony Caldelas makes, and Leonora Neville, others have been broadly in agreement that it stigmatizes the civilization, that it trivializes them. And the example that Leonora Neville gives is if Anna Komnene is described as a Byzantine princess, we automatically think less of her than if we say that she's a Roman princess. Personally, I'm not convinced. To me, the word princess requires no predication. That already suggests something to me in my mind of a prima donna. I don't know why. I hope that a prince has the same value. But my view about that is that it is possible that people, definitely, I have to concede that people have used the word Byzantium and Byzantine as pejorative. And that's without doubt, in the same way that we were saying, like the tax office or whatever, and you say, oh, Byzantine politics there, you just can't sort them out, it's just so hidebound in protocols and, you can never get anywhere with them. And that's Byzantine. So it does definitely carry that baggage. I don't think there's a doubt about that. My feeling is, though, that that's just like Gothic. So Gothic means all sorts of spooky things, like weird. And it was appropriated by people who, wore black nail polish and, very, very dark eyes and spiky hair. And so they're Goths. So right to the present time, this word Gothic retains that kind of air of evil and inclemency and, like threat. But for all that, Gothic artefacts stand proud. And I just don't really credit the idea that it has any effect. I think, yes, meanings have these weird kind of couplings, but in any given context, the genius of language is that you uncouple it. And I don't think it's hard to do. And I certainly don't think that East Roman will solve anything. Like East Roman, if there's something that's kind of a little bit contemptible about the civilization, Nick. then that will attach to East Roman just as much as Byzantium.
You mentioned that Roman has a better effect than Byzantine, or had.
Yes.
What about the Byzantine music in our church? That is a better kind of music for church. It has a deeper sound, closer to nature, rather than the Roman or anything, anything on that side. And I find it hard to see it like you see it, that Roman shows a better quality when I think of music.
Yes.
Because in the Greek church you study Byzantine music and it's considered very high class, for those who know, of course.
Yes.
For
Yes.
those others don't matter.
I completely agree with you. I think Byzantine music is sublime. I love it. I also love music of the Western tradition, polyphony, and also sublime. But I think I was trying to represent the view of others rather than my own personal view. So it got into people's heads that Rome equals authority. And this is unrelated to the value of any productions that are either Roman or Byzantine or Greek. But yes, the liturgy is chanted in Greek. And it's Greek music. I can't think of it as, we can call it East Roman, but to me, yes, I don't share this valorisation of Roman at the expense of Greek. I would love that to stop. I wouldn't want to support it by calling Greeks Romans.
Thank you, Robert. I think your conclusion, if we assume that folk tradition carries any weight for any people, and I assume we do, then your conclusion has a lot of weight. So I personally agree with it. On the point about Anthony Galdelis, I think we need to question where he's coming from. I think it's important because there's a lot of conversation happening in the Greek language, not yet translated into English, in recent years about the work of Anthony Kaldelis. So I think we need to question where he's coming from politically. Nothing in Greek can be explained unless you start from the political angle. It's impossible, especially in the last 50 years, the traumatic impact of the junta, the 7 years, and what's happened since then. So I think in his case, we also need to question why is he not engaging in conversation in Greek with Greek academics who are opposing his views. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to give my own opinion. Those are questions. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the reflection. I wish I could add some insight, but I do know that he runs a very, I've got to say, very engaging podcast.
Sorry to interrupt. He speaks in English to one English-speaking audience. Has not, to my knowledge, and I may be wrong, has not engaged in character arguments that go to primary sources by Greek academics.
Yes, so that was what I was going to say. So and for people who just missed that last comment, he is speaking to an English-speaking audience, to people with people who speak excellent English, and so the comment was that he's not really engaging with a very searching discourse in Greece itself, which is being conducted in the Greek language. And look, I thank you very much for that observation. I'm really interested. I'd love to know more. John.
All right. An art question. There's a perception that during the Byzantine era, or or whatever the Christian era, there's no progress, or very little, in terms of the arts and
Yes.
a lot of other things. So maybe that adds to the whole dismissing the Byzantine era as being not worthy of study, because there was very little going on. There was, in the arts, it was stagnant, either in painting or sculpture, whereas the previous eras, like
Yes.
the Hellenistic, there was constant progress in.
Yes.
And so what's your opinion on that, and how that could add to the derogatory,
Oh, yeah.
because
Yes.
you being an art. So.
Yes, yes. I completely agree. The image has been cast on Byzantine art that it is static inherently, that it didn't evolve. Static both in the figures don't seem to move much, and, you know, are seen in sort of serial conformity, and in that it doesn't change from decade to decade or century to century. Very, very false, as, you know, lots of scholars have demonstrated. You know, Ivana Jevtic and our own Olympia produced a really nice suite of examples that showed Komnenian art in radical contrast to earlier production, and where there was plenty of experiment and certainly emotional engagement with stories and so on, all ingredients that make for progress, if we're to use that as the sort of benchmark of artistic excellence. So I think we've turned a blind eye to that. You're absolutely right that for the greater promotion of the West, we have artificially denounced this sort of sterility of the East. And very unfortunate, and it's long-lasting. It's like a bruise that won't go away. And yeah, it's like a sort of enduring coronavirus of the arts that just won't go away. And there is a vaccine, but it doesn't kind of eliminate it.
One other thing that I've read there is that the Renaissance came about because of the fall of Constantinople, and all of the art and all the knowledge was taken to Italy.
Yes, yes,
Is
yes.
that any truth?
Yes, there's a lot of truth to that. The early Italian artists were beholden to Greek exemplars, and often Greek artists themselves who were in their employ. And the whole sort of iconic tradition was a sort of import. It does explain in many ways the prestige and excellence of Venetian art, this leadership, position of leadership. And things like chromatic modelling and so on came from Greece. I think that's a very important story to tell, the maniera greca.
Okay, I think we might bring proceedings to a close. I was going to ask you, Robert, can the present Greek state be described as Byzantine, but we won't go there, so maybe next time. I think we need to have round two. Judged by my assessment, the infidels have a slight lead, so we need to get you back for round two. A small gift from the community. Thank you for the presentation, and a big round of applause for our speaker tonight.